Hey guys, so if you hear noise in the background, it's just because I'm sitting outside, so don't mind that. We are doing chapter 5, The Family Fears. This is part 1. My mother and my father were both one of 8 or 9 children, and each of them came from very poor families. By the time I was in high school, they were affluent. My father was a banker and my mother played bridge, and they went on nice vacations, and we had drapes that somebody came to our house and designed. You know, things like that, which in my town were quite hoity-toity. I had nice clothes and proper dental care and all of that stuff. But when I got pregnant, it was like slipping back a generation somehow. It was like slipping back in time. The climbing that they had done and their aspirations were suddenly under threat. They were going to be those people that they looked down on. There was a clear social category for unwed mothers, and that was the "you must not come from a very good home" category. I think it was impossible for my parents to get past those feelings and to see me as somebody who needed some help from them. They had no choice. They had to find a place for me to go where they didn't have to deal with the questions and the funny looks. It was just more than they could take. Deborah. When I heard the women recount their stories, one of the most shocking aspects of their experience was the way they were treated by their families. It's hard to imagine how the families could have been so harsh. Ay. In order to understand the actions of these families and the intensity of the pressure to relinquish, it is helpful to take into account the enormous social pressures to conform that followed World War II. The 1950s are notorious as a decade of mass conformity, but it's revealing to look more closely at the social forces at work during those years. The post-war period was a time of remarkable new prosperity, in which a significant number of American families joined the middle class. Though that was true disproportionately for white families because of continuing racial discrimination. For those families who were moving up, whether white or black, there was a tremendous fear of losing the ground they had gained. Conforming to the middle-class values of the time was paramount. Many of the women I interviewed spoke about their parents' fears of being ruined if anyone learned that they had an unmarried pregnant daughter. The parents' fears of being ostracized from their community or church ultimately led them to treat their daughters in precisely the same manner that they feared their neighbors would treat them. Okay, pausing there. This still happens, obviously, not to the same extent, but it really does happen majorly in very, pardon me by using the word cult-like, because that's what it is, cult-like religions, right? So like Mormons, LDS, not nearly as much as LDS, but Mormons, Amish, Mennonite, a lot of deep Christians, a lot of Christians that are like deep in the Bible Belt, right? Not nearly as bad, but still, it happens. I will be honest, I'm not sure about the Judaism or the Muslim, or some other religions, but I do know very much when it comes to the others, very Christian-based, Catholic-based, that it still looks very much down upon, right? And it's sad to think that in 2023, this is still happening. It's sad that it happened even then, but still, it's still happening, right? We haven't evolved at that point. Anyway, we're going to continue reading. I told my mother, and she started screaming at me. It was horrific. I was told to leave the house and not return. I was not allowed to make a phone call. I was not allowed to take any clothes, pack a suitcase, nothing. I don't remember where I went to use a phone, but I called the doctor I had babysat for, and I went to their house. I stayed with them. I guess he pleaded with my mother and father to let me come home. He told them I needed my family and that was where I belonged. He was right, but they refused to take me back. Mary 3. Studies of relinquishment patterns suggest that unmarried pregnant women who chose to make their children available for adoption were generally from higher socioeconomic backgrounds and had higher educational aspirations than those who chose to parent. Another characteristic cited was that women who surrendered their children were more likely to have parents who were supportive of their placement decision. The backgrounds of most of these women I interviewed were consistent with these findings, though I would use different language to describe the parents' sentiments. In most cases, especially those involving high school or college students, parents not only supported the placement decision, but made the decision. The vast majority of these parents insisted that their daughter surrender her child. I told my parents, I can't do this. And they said, you can't come here. You can't bring her here. My father said, you'll have other children. People have asked me how I got through it, and I say I just turned myself into stone. Edith. Most of the women I interviewed did not refer to the surrender of their child as a choice at all. Choice implies making a decision between at least two viable options, with few exceptions. These women felt like they had no other option. Many were in their 20s, but still would have needed some family support, either with babysitting while they worked or with an offer to live at home until they could get on their feet. Rather than offering help, many families threatened to ostracize their daughter if she kept her child. Most parents simply took over when they discovered their daughter was pregnant and made arrangements for her to go away and relinquish the child. The women often likened their experience to being moved along a conveyor belt with no discussion, no weighing of options, and no say in the decision. They felt they were in no position to object, since they had already brought the shame upon the family by becoming pregnant. My father took me to the family doctor, and when we came back to the house, my father told my mother she fainted. They conferred with my boyfriend's parents as to what to do, and this decision was to send me to a home because I was from a very middle-class type of family, and my mother didn't want anybody to know about it. I had to drop out of school because the schools didn't allow you to attend school pregnant in those days. We had to make up a story, and I couldn't go anywhere. If my mother had to take me shopping, we'd go out of town, someplace where we wouldn't run into anybody. My mother was always worried about what people would think, and that was probably the worst part of it for me. She was worried about what people would think, and specifically about what they would think about her. That affected all the decisions that were made up. My mother decided that I was going to give the baby up. I didn't decide that. Diane too. One of the sentiments that was expressed by many of the women I interviewed was that their mothers felt betrayed by them. And that sense of betrayal seems to have fueled the intensity of disgust and anger that so many parents, especially mothers, inflicted on their daughters. This still happens today, by the way, this feeling betrayed. And a lot, I don't know the statistics, I would love to find that. A lot of adoptees actually go no contact with their adoptive parents. I also would love to know the statistics of how many birth mothers or parents, fathers too, would go no contact with their parents because of this, because they had no decision. And, I do often hear, reunion stories, as we've heard in this book, where the grandparents regret doing that, right? They're glad for the reunion and they felt bad for it. So, I'm kind of interested in that. I know that when I was relinquished, I was adopted, right? That my biological mother, she didn't really have the choice because my father's mother, my paternal grandmother, forced the decision. There was no support, there was no resources, and my mother already was ostracized because she had left the Mennonites, which is what her family was. So she really didn't have support or resources and all that. But when she did return so I was born, and then she went into a mental institution for a little while, and then she came out, and she went to go live with my grandparents, her parents again. They regretted that she felt like she didn't have that support, and they would have helped her, right? So it's one of those things that, and by the way, this was back in the early 90s. So yes, it's a big difference, but still there's still that feeling of lack of support and resources, right? And again, we're talking 30 years later, and this stuff is still happening, even though you can Google, resources and stuff. There's still a huge lack of what's needed, because the adoption industry really makes the coercion look so easy, right? They tell these massive lies because they want to make a profit. Anyway, we're going to continue on. In all those months I was sent away, my mother did not visit me. My father would drive an hour and take me out for the afternoon. We went for ice cream. We went for walks. He never looked at my belly, and we never talked about it at all. I don't know what we talked about, but he was there for me. Cheryl. My mother was horrified. She called me a slut, a whore. No wonder he followed you around like a dog in heat all the time. My dad looked at me and said, "Have you been with a man?" Which was the terminology of the day. I could only nod my head yes. Yes, Daddy's little girl had been with a man. That was hard. And it seemed like just a day or so after that, my mother came in and had me go to the bathroom, disrobe, and get into the bathtub, which was very humiliating in itself. She administered a douche, which was very painful. I didn't know anything about a douche. I found later that she had used a Lysol from the brown bottle. I blocked that out of my mind for 20-something years. One day my husband was cleaning and I smelled the Lysol and it took me back. Polly. The rise in social status for many families after the war and the concomitant pressures on these families to conform to middle-class standards were unprecedented. By the mid-1950s, almost 60% of the population enjoyed a middle-class income, as compared with 31% in the years before the Great Depression. Government-guaranteed loans had allowed returning veterans to purchase single-family homes by financing up to 90% of their mortgage at low interest rates. In 1947 alone, 800,000 GIs received home loans. The difficulty was building homes fast enough to meet the demand. For 16 consecutive years from 1929 to 1945, new construction had not kept pace with the need for housing. And as GIs returned from the war and married, demand intensified. Private developers were poised to meet this need with assistance from the government. Developers received tax incentives and government guaranteed that allowed them to build enormous suburban developments like Levittown, the Long Island community of 17,000 homes built by Levitt and Sons between 1947 and 1951. Before the war, about one-third of homes had been built by their owners and another third by small contractors, who built a handful of homes every year. But by the late 1950s, two-thirds of all houses built in the United States were erected by big builders who primarily created uniform suburban developments that were monotonous, but affordable. Mortgages on the new suburban homes often cost less per month than the cost of renting an apartment. Okay, pausing there. Before I moved to the house that I'm in now full time, the area that I lived in, I was in New York City. I lived in the Stuyvesant Peter Cooper area, and that area was actually built. So Peter Cooper was built in the 1940s for the officers of the war to return home and have a nice apartment, right? And then Stuytown, which is right across the street, was built for the petty officers, the soldiers, the ones that didn't have the high rankings. And again, very uniform when it comes to the way that the buildings look and pretty much the way that the apartments looked at the time. I know that when I lived there, we had an unrenovated apartment because, we lived there since I was born, basically. But those buildings, and a lot of buildings in New York City were built during that time to house, soldiers coming home. Now, granted, I'm in a newer home. The house that I'm in now, was built by hand by the owner. We're literally the second owners that have ever lived in this house. And it's not only a big difference because of location and the materials used and the love that went into this house, but our house looks different in many ways from houses that are somewhat similar. I'm in a log cabin now. But it's still different. Like when you look at pictures of log cabins, even from New York area, because they're actually quite popular in my area, each one is unique in its own way. And that's what's kind of really beautiful and cool about it. Whereas a lot of buildings and like houses, townhouses, they all look the same. It's all uniform. So it's kind of sad. Anyway, sorry, I went on a rant. Let's continue going. Housing starts from 114,000 in 1944 to 1.62 million in 1950, whereas only 40% of families had owned their houses at the end of World War II. 60% were homeowners by 1960. Between 1950 and 1960, 18 million people moved to the suburbs. All these new homes needed furniture, appliances, a television, and often 2 cars, and all of that purchasing furthered the economic boom. Americans bought 20 million refrigerators, 11.6 million televisions, and 21.4 million cars in the 4 years that followed the end of the war. Okay, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. I know quite a bit about World War II, from the history books, but following the war, the most that I know is from what my parents had lived, and their childhood, because they were born right at the end of World War II. So my mom lived between Brooklyn and the Boston area. She went back and forth because of her family. And then my dad lived the first 4 to 5 years in Germany because his dad was a colonel. And, he was out there with the family. But, it makes sense because, everything that we know about in the 1950s, 1960s, even from movies, it's very uniform. They show the middle class a lot. And, looking back, it all just seems the same. Anyway, let's continue on. The percentage of the population had conformed to the post-war model of the perfect nuclear family was also far greater at this time than any time in history. During the 1950s and 1960s, the percentage of the population that was married rose considerably and was higher by about 10% than it was before or has been since. In census reports from 1900s to 1940, the percentage of the population the percentage of the population that was married moved up or down in a relatively small increments and averaged about 58%. But in 1950, the figure rose to 66% and then climbed to 68% in 1960. After 1970, this percentage started to return to pre-war levels. And in the 1980s, the percentage of the population that was married was the same as the 1900s, 54%. In the U.S. Census for 2000, the percentage was also 54%. After the war, the average age at which couples married also dropped. The median age at first marriage in the 1980s was the same as 1890, roughly age 22 for women and 26 for men. However, between 1945 and 1960, the median age for marriage drops to an average of 20.5 for women and 20.75 for men. By 1950, almost 60% of women between 18 and 24 years were married. Most couples had completed their families before they reached age 30, and they also had more children than in previous decades. Women who reached adulthood in the 1930s had an average of 2.4 children, whereas those who did so in the 1950s had 3.2 children. The sum total of these changes added up to the baby boom, and by definition includes those born between 1946 and 1964. Even though marriage and child-rearing norms of the time came to be seen as characteristic of traditional American family life, in fact, they were abnormal in comparison with marriage and childbearing patterns throughout the 20th century. Writers and sociologists of the time began to identify a major shift in the American psyche. Sociologist David Reisman, in his 1950 book, The Lonely Crowd, identified a transformation in social character, away from the inner-directed individualism that had been valued in the 19th century to other-directedness and a shift from production to consumption. William White argued in his 1956 the bestseller The Organization Man that white-collar men increasingly subordinate their independence and personal goals to conform to corporate demands so that they would belong to a group and fit in. Both of these men argued that the suburbs were an extension of corporate life and that people willingly accepted their life of conformity as part of a package that included the creature comforts they now possessed. It may well have been impossible for families to step out of line if they wanted to hold on to what they had. Between 1952 and 1956, although disposable income increased 21%, borrowing had increased 55%. And by the end of the 1950s, almost half of families were deeply in debt and had less than $200 in liquid assets. You have no idea what things were like in the 1960s. Everything depended on your social status and what everybody said about you. And if this befell you, you just got axed, totally to the bottom of the pit somewhere, at least in my mother's eyes. And she had worked so hard to build up our status. I mean, it was just a sham. You have this perfect facade. One boy, one girl, achieve in school, and all this kind of stuff. Meanwhile, at home, I'd go to my room to avoid shouting matches. I mean, basically, the communication style in our families was shout at each other. Yet, we're the perfect family, right? I don't know. Those are the ironies of the 60s. I know there was no sympathy for me whatsoever. I think I did tell them that I was raped, although we didn't have the actual term date rape in that day, and it was still all about how I disgraced her. That's what it was all about. And those who were living the middle-class American dream in suburbia were geographically removed from those who had not benefited from the post-war boom. A prominent feature of the economy of this time was how disproportionately the benefits accrued to white families while economic prosperity lagged behind for African Americans. While millions of white families in the 1950s were purchasing new homes that were affordable because of government-backed developments and home loans, many African American families were being discriminated against through redlining policies that prevented them from moving into these new neighborhoods. William Levitt's contracts, for example, stipulated that residents must be Caucasian, and Levitt was far from alone in preventing African Americans from moving into better neighborhoods. Even many returning African American GIs were excluded from securing loans for homes in desirable areas, and thus from building the home equity that contributed so significantly to the long-term wealth and financial security of their white counterparts. As real estate increased in value over the years, one of the overriding characteristics of social change during this period was, in fact, the white flight from urban communities and multi-ethnic neighborhoods into the suburbs. White as in the builder white, referred to the suburbs as the new melting pot because it was during this time that many white ethnic groups, such as Italian Americans, German Americans, and Irish Americans, and American Jews, began to be thought of as simply white. The lack of opportunity for many African Americans to join the expanding middle class may have played some role in the huge discrepancy between the numbers of children surrendered for adoption during those years by white women versus African American women. Between 1952 and 1972, whites surrendered at an average of 10 times the rate of African Americans. But the relationship between social status and surrender is only part of the picture. The maternity home system, which expanded tremendously after the war to provide a place for girls to live out their pregnancies, primarily served white clientele. Immediately after the war, many maternity homes had the same segregationist policies that were evident in other institutions of the time. In addition, those who were poor, both black and whites, may have been less able to travel to maternity homes in distant cities or to pay the fees that they required. Perhaps some rural and urban poor did not even know about the homes or were not referred to them as readily by doctors or social service agencies. A Florence Crittenton bulletin from 1952 reported that about a third of the 49 maternity homes of the time provided services for African American girls, and 3 were solely for black girls. I'm not going to use that word. And by the way, that was in quotes, so they're referencing something. However, some of these homes were not the large maternity homes that white girls were sent to, but boarding homes that were under the supervision of Florence Crittenton's staff and could take in only a few girls at a time. One of the women I interviewed was sent to such a home. My parents found out I was pregnant, and then there was talk about me not having the baby. I said to them, I won't submit to an abortion. I plan to have my baby. They decided that they were going to send me away, which was a big, big shock because I was so involved in school. I just loved being in the high school band, and my grades were important to me, but they did take me away. They called it a home for unwed mothers, but it was more like a foster home. They had foster children there, and they had one other young lady who came in after I did who was pregnant. The parents in the home were very nice people, but they were elderly people. It was a black home, of course. During this time, this was 1963, everything was pretty much segregated here. My high school was all black. It was just prior to the schools integrating. I grew up from very early childhood until about age 15 in a housing project. And while in today's time you would think of a housing project, you think of abject poverty, single parents, slum-like dwellings. That was none of that. When I grew up in the projects, we knew maybe 2 families that was where there was not a mother and a father in the home. You had 2 parents. You had working parents, and it was expected of you to finish high school and go to college. Being black, most of the people I knew went to college and became teachers. To be single, unwed mother was just something you didn't do. I knew 2 other young ladies who got pregnant. When we were in high school, it was just something you didn't do. You were an outcast, so there wasn't a lot of help for you. I think the main issue was shame. Behaving outside the acceptable norms and bringing shame upon the family. I don't think women were perceived as being capable of raising children without the financial support. Where was I? Of a male. But I can think of quite a number of extended families around where couples moved in with the grandmother and they all lived together and pooled resources. But single parenting, I didn't see. I don't think it was looked upon too favorably. Incidentally, my ex-husband is an adoptee. His mom was married to his father when he was born, but his father was abusive and he told her if she kept the baby, he was leaving. So my husband was raised by a woman who knew his mom and said, "I'll raise your baby." He grew up with an adoptive mom, but he knew who his mother was. My children enjoyed a beautiful relationship with both women, both the natural and adoptive grandmothers. The secrecy and lies weren't there. Carol, too. Okay, I'm going to stop right there for a minute. We've had these discussions, not on this channel, but like on TikTok, and I've had these in person. You know, and I didn't take into account the segregation of the time. I will be totally honest when I've had these conversations where African Americans 100% tend to do a better job about supporting families, right? So if a mother needed the support or needed help with raising the child, family would step in. You know, and I'm not just talking about in the last 30 years. I'm talking about previously. But now it makes total sense why this was happening is because there was not only a huge socioeconomic part of it, you know, where they didn't have the ability to send mothers out. There was also, there's, you know, more to it. You know, they lived not in, as we know, middle class homes, right? They didn't have access to that. They were already seen as less than, you know, even in the 1950s, 1960s. Unfortunately, it sucks. But when I say that, you know, black families, you know, they were still part of the nuclear family. You know, that's something that we don't talk about is they were talking about nuclear families. That included black families, right? And she even mentioned it. Often there were 2 parents in the home, 2 working parents in the home. So it wasn't just white families. She even stated that sometimes they would live with grandparents, and that's totally okay. That's totally great. It gave them more support. But foster care and adoption, and even to this day, so foster care does tend to target impoverished families, for the most part, not so much as abuse. They don't distinguish between abuse and actual poverty most of the time. And I'm not saying that there isn't abuse at times. I'm just saying that a lot of the cases are due to poverty, not so much as abuse. Okay, there's no excuse for abuse. But with adoption, when you're adopting a baby, there is a menu price based off the gender of your child, based off the ethnicity of your child, the health of your child, the location. So Black babies, specifically Black baby boys, are a lot cheaper, and I say that in a very derogatory term towards the adoption industry, right, and towards the adoptive parents, than, say, a white baby girl who was born in America. So that's a huge problem. It's very much still this socioeconomic and segregation part, and that's not okay. Anyway, sorry for my rant, but I just felt like it needed to be said. Continuing on. One concern that was not raised directly by the African American women I interviewed, but was talked about by white women who gave birth to biracial babies in the 1960s, was the fear that adoption agencies would not be able to find a home for the baby, and the child might end up languishing in the foster care system. In fact, race is a factor in the placement of babies for adoption even today. Didn't I just talk about that? Despite the high demand of adoptable babies in this country, and a 140% increase since 1995 in the number of foreign-born children adopted by Americans to meet this demand, some African American babies are sent to foreign countries to be adopted by couples in Canada, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and England. So that I didn't know. I did know that we do sometimes send out babies to other countries, but I know it's not at a higher rate as like we take in, but it makes sense that it's typically non-white babies because of everything that's going on. Anyway, during the 1950s and 60s, there was a great deal of turmoil for both white and African American families when a daughter was discovered to be pregnant. But unlike many middle-class white families of the time, fewer African American families disowned their daughters or insisted that they surrender. In the majority of cases, the baby was absorbed into the extended family or adopted informally. So this is, when we talk about adopted informally, we're talking about like kinship or fictive kin. That is what we aim for because that is important. It's important to be with your family. Even if you cannot be with your biological mom or dad, being with grandparents or aunts and uncles or cousins is still important. Now, that doesn't negate the trauma, but the legal process, if you're going through the legal process, that is, as I said, informally. So sometimes they'll just take the child in. Still allows the child to access that information and have the genetic mirroring that child needs to know, right? And allows them to know their biological family. So again, extremely important things that we aim for. There could still be trauma, but not to the full extent of adopted by strangers. All right. The reasons for this difference are complex and reflect the disparity between the experiences and the social, cultural, and economic histories of Black versus white Americans. Interestingly, today, white surrender rates have dropped to match those of African American women, which have remained fairly constant over the years at approximately 1.5% of premarital births. It is worth noting that the majority of the women I interviewed gave birth in the 1960s, when the white surrender rate was extremely high. In 1964, the percentage of white surrenders was about 40%, almost 27 times the rate of African Americans. The stories of women that appear in this book reflect the difference in black and white surrender rates, in that the vast majority of the women I interviewed are white and most were raised in blue-collar or white-collar middle-class families, or homes, A common belief at the time was that the girls from affluent homes routinely obtained abortions out of the country or through doctors in their communities who charged a hefty sum. Those who desired and could afford an illegal abortion could often find one. It is estimated that between 250,000 and 1 million illegal abortions took place each year in the post-war years. These backroom abortions were often highly dangerous and were responsible for 40% of all maternal deaths. Some women who might have been able to afford these illegal procedures chose not to get such abortion because of that danger. All right, pausing there for a moment. This is continuing to happen with the overturn of Roe versus Wade and the lack of access for abortions. Those who want have to travel out of state, and now some states are trying to weaponize that travel ban for that to put them in jail because of it. It's so wrong. And so when they're going to back rooms, and, we're talking about not appropriate, safe abortions that are very much available in some states, like my own, I'm in New York, it's going to cause rates to go up in death for these situations. Anyway, we're going to continue on. Another factor that intensified the pressure on individuals and families to conform after the war was the escalating fear of communism. This climate of fear and suspicion led to both legitimate inquiry and reckless persecution of people who were suspected of being communist sympathizers. Many civil servants, actors, and writers lost their livelihood for holding views that were left to center, meaning they were more liberal-leaning. Anyway, the fear of internal subversive forces fueled an obsession with the non-marital sexual behavior and efforts to identify individuals thought to be sexual perverts who had infiltrated our government and were considered to be as dangerous as actual communists. Anyone with a sordid past or believed to have been involved in unsanctioned sexual behavior was suspect. In the climate of Cold War paranoia, loose women and homosexuals were especially suspect and thought to pose security risks since they were presumed to be weak by nature and therefore susceptible to blackmail. All right, pausing there. Obviously, we know this is not true, but we are about to hear a story soon about why they thought this could be. Anyway, continuing on. Women who did not subscribe to the prevailing domestic model were seen as a threat both to the family and to society. It was not at all uncommon for women perceived as loose to be seen as the responsible party when it came to a whole host of problems that required a male counterpart. During the war, loose women were blamed for spreading venereal disease. The government warned soldiers against seductive women who might be spies in disguise and against good girls whose morals had loosened due to wartime independence, and who threatened happy homes by luring men away from their wives and children. The nuclear family, and by the way, they still considered the nuclear family to be white, despite it being also black. So I just want to make that clear. We are going to go more into that. The nuclear family typified by a male breadwinner and a wife who stayed home and devoted herself to the needs of her husband and children, was held up not only as the ideal, but also as a patriotic endeavor. Men and women who did not conform to this model risked being perceived as perverted, immoral, unpatriotic, and pathological. The belief being espoused was that the strength of our country depended on manly men whose lives were typified by marriage and procreation, and on womanly women who did not compete with men or otherwise emasculate them. This ideal woman was subservient, domestic, and sought fulfillment through her role as wife and mother to the next generation of children who would continue to fight the Red Menace. The census was that happiness for both men and women depended on marriage. A survey from the time indicated that only 9% of those polled believed that a single person could be happy. After the war, women vacated or were pushed out of the high-paying jobs they held and into low-paying or part-time jobs to make way for the returning veterans. With the expanding economy, it was feasible for more men to earn a decent living, and a wife working outside the home came to be looked upon as evidence of a man's inability to support his family. Nevertheless, the number of working wives doubled between 1940 and 1960, and as consumption rose, many families depended on mom's part-time income to meet the monthly bills and allow them to retain their middle-class lifestyle. Despite the fact that many wives were working, their primary responsibility was taking care of the home and raising the children. Women who could not find fulfillment in canning, housework, and changing diapers were seen as neurotic. They just don't want women to have brains. That's what it is. Since child rearing was the mother's primary responsibility, it was also her fault if the children did not turn out right. Having a daughter who was pregnant was unequivocal proof that of her failure and of the family's social standing in the community could instantly plummet, since it was commonly accepted that only bad or low-class families were plagued with such problems. And again, when we talk about bad or low-class families, we're still talking about, we're not saying that white families couldn't be seen that way. They absolutely were. But they're also saying that the majority of black families were, because of racism and because of segregation and because the laws completely discriminated against them. Again, something that we're going to be discussing in this chapter. So I just want to make that very clear. Okay, continuing on. I feel that my mother was such a victim of the times, and as was I. Later, when my daughter from my marriage was born, I saw a side of her that I didn't remember from when I was young. It must have been very, very hard for her, but she did what she had to do. She did what society dictated. Years later, she told me that she was very much afraid that if anyone at work had found out that I was pregnant, she would have lost her job. She was a single parent before the term was coined. My father had abandoned the family when I was under 4 years old, and he didn't provide any support. She did not admit to being divorced because that was such a social stigma attached to being divorced then. She told people that she was a widow. My mother and aunt made their home together. They were both clerical workers at the Milwaukee Journal, and if my mother had lost her job, it would have been a horrible economic situation for us. She did what she had to do, and it was hard for her, but she was from the generation that didn't show their emotions, and certainly didn't talk. You don't talk about feelings. What are feelings? You do what you have to do. She was not a cold, heartless person, but it was just a different time. Annie. Polls from the mid-1950s indicate that housewives were not nearly as content in their marriages as they were supposed to be. In the studies from the time, researchers concluded women were twice as likely as men to report that they were dissatisfied or regretted their marriages. But given few high-paying jobs for women, a 26% decline in women's wages after the war, and the stigma of divorce and single motherhood, many wives stayed put even if they were dissatisfied. Their social pressures experienced by the mothers of this generation come through powerfully in many of the interviews I conducted. Oh my goodness. Okay, sorry. So as we can see, then even divorce, losing a husband was even kind of stigmatized. Not nearly as bad, but it was a little bit more accepted, but still not. Being a single parent, everything is always on the mother, right? On the woman. Now, does this still happen today? Yes, not nearly to the same extent, at least when it comes to non-religious communities. So, like, if you're in a very religious community like the Amish or the Mormons, a little bit in Judaism, but I again don't know all that much about Judaism in that sense. What I do know is from my adoptive mother's side, so I only know more about the food and the holidays in that sense. But there's definitely still a stigma to parenting as a single parent, and choosing to parent as a single parent like I do. And it's not easy. It's not easy by any means. But, you got to do what you got to do. And what's best for the baby is to be with biological family, and that could include grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins. So, putting that out there. Anyway, continuing on. From what I could figure, I don't think my mother ever really wanted to have kids. She said that when the war came, World War II, she dropped out of college and went to work. She's always resented that she didn't finish college and have a career and do more with her life. She was a very intelligent woman. She resented being home, being the housewife. She didn't like that role at all. She didn't like the cleaning, the whole thing. She said she was dissatisfied even up to the time of her death. Having 5 children was just too much for her. This wasn't what she wanted. At the time, women stayed in the home. They were the housewife. They didn't work outside the home. There were no divorces at the time either. It was a very rare thing when somebody got divorced. So a lot of families stayed together that shouldn't have. Women would get together and have their coffee clutches and talk about somebody's husband running around and somebody with somebody else and how unhappy they are. And this one's getting beat up. These days, they never would have stayed together, but they did at that time. I think the wives leaned on their friends, their women friends, a whole lot. I think that's why my mother didn't want to have her friends find out. She had a circle of maybe 8 or 10 women who hung together and did the Girl Scout thing. They were troop leaders and they visited all the time, and I think they depended on each other for support. I think she felt that she wouldn't be accepted by them if they knew I was pregnant. She didn't want their pity. She wanted to be the one they came to. She was a very proud woman. Carol won. My mom married my dad in California in 1942, and he shipped out overseas, and he was gone until 1944 or 1945. During the time, she worked in an airplane factory and lived by herself. She used to tell us how proud she was. They worked so hard, they wanted those airplanes to be the best for their boys, She made friends. She was very happy. She saved her money. She had a good little nest egg by the time the war was over. Then my dad comes home from the war and they started their little farm. They farmed the land that my mom's dad and mother had cleared. They used her folks' barn and used her money to buy the land and the cows, but he told her what to do. She went from being an independent woman to being somebody who was absolutely dictated to. She had to live in a house with no electricity, wash diapers by hand, and wash diapers by hand. A few years later, she tried to get a job at the hospital doing a little laundry work, and he had a fit. She worked for 1 week while his mother stayed with us, but it wasn't good enough. He wouldn't let her work. She had the independence, and then all of a sudden, it was all gone. Then he lost the farm and took the money that was left and brought a brand new 1953 Oldsmobile with it. When she inherited more money from an aunt years later, that money bought a house, and she lost that after the divorce because she couldn't keep it up. It used to make me so angry that she was just like a lapdog, but it was the expectation of the 50s. You were supposed to be a good little housewife. You were supposed to keep things clean, get the bed made, get snacks made for the kids. Yet he could just tramp through the house with his muddy feet, and that was okay. It had to have been a terrible shock for her to come back from her war job to that little dirt farm to try to make a go of it. She was absolutely stifled. Glory. My mom told me that she had been date raped by my father, and that's the reason they were married. Ew, that's horrible. I was that child. I was the product. It was February in the woods of Wisconsin, and she screamed and tried to get out of the car, and he said, "Fine, I'll just leave you here to freeze." He date raped her in the car, and then he dropped her off at her farm. 2 months later, she discovered she was pregnant. She finally told her parents, and her father tracked my dad down and told my mom, "You're going to marry him because that's what you do. You're going to get married." She stayed married because she was Catholic, and that's what you did. He was a savage drunk. We used to wake up in the middle of the night with him calling her unspeakable names. We just accepted that. He was our dad. He was nice to us, and when he was sober, he was fine. They even had some good times together. When he died, at the showing before the funeral, the family was all sitting there, and Mom went to his casket and knelt down and just sobbed hysterically. And I thought, my God, why is she doing that? She came and sat down next to me, and I said, "Mom, why are you crying?" She said, "For 50 years, for 50 wasted years." Joyce, too. One of the most compelling ways in which the image of the perfect family was established and reinforced was through the television shows of the time. Many of the most popular shows included Leave It to Beaver, which ran 1957 to 1963, Father Knows Best, 1954 to 1963, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, 1952 to 1966, and The Donna Reed Show, 1958 to 1966, which featured perfect nuclear families with nurturing dads and moms who deferred to their husbands and did the housework in perfectly coiffed hairdos. An especially revealing feature of television shows of the time was the popularity of shows featuring widowed fathers, including The Rifleman, which ran 1958 to 1963, The Andy Griffith Show, 1961 and 1968, although Andy had quite a bit of help from Aunt Bee, My Three Sons, 1960 to 1972, and Bonanza, 1959 to 1973. Two programs featured father figures who raised orphans, A Boy in Fury, 1955 to 1966, and A Girl in Bachelor Father, 1957 to 1962. And in Sky King, 1951 to 1954, a fatherly uncle came out of the blue western sky every week in his plane, the Songbird, to spend his days with his niece, Penny. Meanwhile, there were no popular shows of the time that featured single mothers, not even widowed moms, even though in the aftermath of World War II, many more widowed women than men were actually raising kids on their own. I can't even say that word. Oh my God, y'all. It is not my day today. Anomaly is a powerful testimony to the social stigma of single motherhood. Despite the stigma, many families did allow their daughters to keep their children and even help to raise them. Studies of the time show that women whose families did offer help to raise their children were, for the most part, from less economically advantaged families or from families that had a previous experience with single pregnancy. I did interview women whose families had offered to help, but who elected to surrender nonetheless. In these cases, the women surrendered either because they did not want to raise the children in the environment being offered, because they felt it was not economically feasible, or because they saw education as the only hope for a better life. I was a senior in high school, and we had a really strong romance going on, and it was really difficult because he was white and I'm black. There we were in Georgia, trying to date, so all kinds of horrible things happened to us. I got pregnant coming up to Brown University to spend the weekend with him. He took me to see Dionne Warwick as a birthday present. I don't know when I started to feel like I wasn't in love with him enough to get married, but I was sensible. Something told me, you better figure out a way to go to school. I really wanted an education. I had been in the Upward Bound program, and it had given me just a little glimpse of what was out there. When I was growing up, it was all about being maid and cleaning somebody else's home. Being married to a man who could treat you like a dog. I was sick and tired of the ignorance I saw around me. I was tired of the men treating the women like crap. You couldn't even fight the system because you didn't have the words. I decided I'm not going to be part of that. My education was the only key I had. That's what they were saying all over the country. That's what Kennedy was saying. That's what Dr. King was saying. My mother was the worst about it. She ragged me a lot of times about giving my baby up. She would get mad and say, I don't understand why you just couldn't bring her home. That's my grandbaby. I did say to her, because I don't want her to have the influence. I didn't want her to have the influence of my stepdaddy, Rose. So as you can see, that's just one story, but as we talked about earlier, African American or Black families were much more willing to help raise the children and through pregnancy than white families. And as Ann Fessler just stated, a lot of the times the economic feasibility was a lot lower, but it still happened. All right, continuing on. My mother was the unwed mother. She was in a mother and baby's home in England for 6 months, 3 months while she was pregnant with me, and 3 months afterward. About a month before I had my daughter, late in the evening when the younger kids were sleeping, my mom was sitting in the rocker and I was laying on the couch, and for the first time, she talked about my biological father. I think she was trying to relate to me by saying, I know what you're going through. She told me how much I would have liked him, how he was such a nice man, how much she loved him, and how good looking he was in his Canadian Air Force uniform. My mother loved uniforms. She told me how they danced. I was born in 1946, after the war, but they had known each other during the war. She told me that my grandmother had said she shouldn't come home with me, and she didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew she wasn't leaving the maternity home without me. Evidently, Grandma relented, and we left the home when I was 3 months old. After I delivered and came home from the hospital, I was lying in my bed crying, and my mom came in and said, What are you crying about? And I said, I want my baby. I love my baby. And my mom said, if you really loved her, you would have kept her. Oh, God, I've heard that, too. As an adoptee, if your birth mom really loved you, she would have kept you. as if they really had much choices. It's so gross to say, not only to birth moms, but to adoptees, even in today's world. Sorry, ranting here, but it is really nasty to say. So please don't say that to anyone. I stopped crying and I never cried again. I never cried until 1999, when I found my daughter. I didn't think I had the right to cry. My mother and I never spoke of my daughter again. Not one word ever again. For all those years, I thought my mother was wicked and horrible for saying that to me. But now I think she was disappointed. I think she was disappointed because of what she went through. She had me and kept me. No matter how our lives turned out, and my mother paid her price, marrying the man that she did, and through that, us kids suffered. But no matter the childhood, I am so thankful that I was with my mother, Christine. Married couples who were not raising children seemed odd in the pronatal environment of the 1950s and 1960s. The desire to parent and to conform to the normal social family expectations of the time imposed substantial strain on couples who could not conceive. Such couples turned to adoption in record numbers during those years, and the rising demand of adoptable children intensified the pressure applied to young women to surrender. This is still happening in today's world. It's really, really gross. One of the most common arguments made to unmarried pregnant women of the time was that the children would have a better life if they surrendered to a married couple who would have more to offer economically and could offer legitimacy to an otherwise illegitimate child. Many women I interviewed recounted how maternity home and adoption agency workers strenuously made this case to them. The staff were very condescending and very judgmental. They would say, "Your child will be better off without you. You're doing the right thing. There's a loving home out there." And I was thinking, well, how come I can't be a loving mother? Kathy, too. The intense social pressures that families felt during the 1950s and 1960s and the stigma associated with unwed pregnancy have waned dramatically over the last 40 years, for the most part. I mean, it's still out there, so that's an issue. In fact, young women who place children for adoption are now more likely viewed by their peers as selfish, and their actions thought of incomprehensible. So I actually hear the opposite. I still hear that birth mothers are selfless and that they're doing the right thing. The only ones that I hear are selfish are those who, more for like adoptees. That's not to say that it's complex. In a way, it's selfish because you're not putting the child first, and oftentimes they don't have the information, about alternatives to external care, which is why we're talking about this. And again, I'm not putting blame out there for birth moms. I'm explaining that there's still a lot of stigma around this, right? But my goal here on this page is for education and to hopefully change the adoption, and the privatized infant adoption industry, because it's disgusting. There are external care options that are needed when possible, right? And they are more child-centric. But that doesn't negate the trauma. It doesn't negate the information needed and the therapy. So I just want to make that clear. No blame to birth moms. I'm not in their position, but I do have an understanding of what they went through, right? Especially reading this book and listening to many birth moms. There's less blame on birth moms, right? If you did give your child away in the sense that you really didn't want the baby, then yeah, you kind of are selfish, In most cases, though, that's not what it is, right? 99% of birth moms actually wanted to raise their children and couldn't because of something. Mainly, 95% due to poverty, 4% due to domestic abuse or substance abuse. But that doesn't mean that they don't want to raise their baby. So we're making that clear here. They just needed help. Anyway, the very same language used against mothers who did not want to surrender their children 40 years ago. For mothers who surrendered in the 50s and 60s, a more tolerant society today offers little solace. Instead, the change in views underscores the flexible nature of societal attitudes and the degree to which the women's lives were governed by the attitudes of their time. They were well aware that many who have grown up in subsequent generations, including their surrendered sons and daughters, cannot understand how mothers could have given away their own flesh and blood. 3 years later, and my life would have had a different outcome. 3 years later, and the first girls in the area were pregnant and staying in school. I mean, I think about that. 1,200 days later, you didn't have to go to unwed mothers' homes. You didn't have to give your baby up. And you didn't have to hide in shame. 1,200 days later, I was scared for my baby all those years. I never slept through the night. I never made it through a night without wondering how she was. Susan, too. All right, guys. I will see you guys tomorrow for Jeanette's story. And then we're going to slowly get back on track. I am so sorry about that. I meant to upload this last week, and it's been chaos here. So this week, we're going to do all the readings one day at a time, and then we'll be back on track for next week. So I will see you tomorrow.